Welcome to Integrative Family Medicine of Asheville's Community Event Series. Our mission as a family medical practice is to provide a better alternative to the status quo of healthcare and help our patients achieve the full potential for their health and wellness. That's why we established the first direct primary care medical practice in Western North Carolina. And our community events like this one are free and open to the public at large because individual health and community health are really important to us. Today's topic is really important. It is masculinity in the modern era, mental health, purpose, and meaning. We wanted to focus on this area because of the research and work being done by Richard Reeves, the Brookings Institute, and more. We were alarmed by statistics such as the risk of suicide is 4 times higher for boys and young men than their female counterparts. Suicide risk has risen by 40% among younger men since the year 2010, and boys are 3 times more likely to be expelled than girls from school. There are pages of statistics like this up here between the 3 of us. It goes on. So very important topic. My name is Ariana Figueroa, and I'm the event facilitator for Integrative Family Medicine, and I'll be coordinating or facilitating this event. We're very, very lucky tonight to have 2 incredible gentlemen who are local mental health experts, and in particular, experts in mental health, male mental health. So Derek Rinaldo, right here, is a licensed clinical mental health counselor with a private practice in Asheville, here in town. For the past 35 years, in various roles, he has primarily worked with men and boys struggling with trauma, addiction, depression, and anxiety. Derek has led men's retreats and therapeutic men's groups, focusing on reestablishing actionable, grounded connection with one's masculine and feminine, physical, emotional, and spiritual health. And Dr. Justin Davella is a licensed psychologist in private practice here in this area. He works with individuals and couples both locally and in the state of California. In addition to his practice, he provides clinical consultations and training to fellow clinicians and advises entrepreneurs and organizations in the mental health and wellness space. He's passionate about supporting men in discovering greater clarity, deeper sense of aliveness, and unlocking a more enriching experience of themselves, their relationships, and their purpose. Without more details, I just want to say thank you again, both of you, for being here and dive into our topic. So my first question to guide this conversation is, can you tell us about the increase in suicide, anxiety, and depression rates among men?
I'll do my best. There's lots of statistics supporting that men are really suffering. And actually, women have greater rates of depression and anxiety than men do, though men are rising faster in these areas than women are. And men have 4 times the rate of suicide than women do. Older men have the biggest chunk, over 65 have the biggest chunk of suicide. Rising quickly is the range of age up to about 35 is rising faster. So in my practice, I'm a clinician, I'm not a statistician or a researcher, so I work with men in the office on the ground. And so when a man comes, oftentimes it's his mother or partner woman who is calling for him. That is pretty astounding.
I think there's a lot of stigmatization around men's mental health due to old traditional roles of what masculinity is, including emotional suppression, dominance and power and control and strength. So men are left in large degree. The labor market has really been changing a lot in favor of women, which is fantastic. Educational areas have changed. Title IX in 1972 really changed the educational field for women. Thankfully, women were, another statistic here, I'm gonna botch it, but it's reversed, that where women were 13% less likely to get a college degree, now it's 15% less likely that men are gonna get a college degree. On all fronts in education, women and girls are outpacing boys and men. So, and in the labor market, women have risen and gotten largely independent from men in marriage and not locked in. And that's a wonderful thing. We don't want to diminish that, but that leaves men out of a lot of places and not and unsure of where they fit. Unemployment rate for men has risen 8%, which is about 9 million men today are out of work compared to like 1979, which it was like, only like 1 million men were out of work. Globalization and industrialization or de-industrialization, post-industrialization.
Whatever age
Whatever it is. Those were like the manly jobs, and those are really gone to like more commercial or not commercial, but like certified jobs, educational jobs. So men are kind of left without not knowing where to turn. So
in the lack of having some of the traditional roles that were held, in the lack of having societal structure as it was 50 or 60 years ago, which as a woman, well, I don't think any of us are not so grateful that women have and girls have the opportunities they have now.
Yeah.
And also, there is a lack, there's a dearth of identity and a purpose and a structure for men.
Yep.
And it's really big. It's a big deal. And you can connect that back to labor. You can connect it to education. You can connect it to all these areas.
Yeah.
What would you add?
Exactly.
Yeah, I mean, just to take it back for a minute, the suicide is on the rise in the United States across the board. Over the last 25 years, the rate of suicide in the United States has increased by 36%. And as you were saying, men are 4 times more likely to commit suicide. I think one of the stats from the book you mentioned is that if men committed suicide at the rate that women committed suicide, there would be 500,000 more men alive today than there are. We're seeing that across the board, and I also want to name that there's an intersectional piece. Those rates are significantly higher for indigenous men from the continental United States and Alaska, as well as black men. Black teens, in particular, the suicide rate of black teens increased by also 36% over a 3-year period between 2018 and 2021. The way that I kind of understand that is kind of the intersection between what we're talking about and then overlaying racism on top of that, and the both kind of the structural and implicit challenges of living with that. Men go to the doctor less. This is, Asheville family medicine. They, in general, go to PCPs. They schedule and attend PCP visits at a rate of 50% less than women do on average. Why is that important? Well, PCPs are essentially front line for not only medical, but also mental health issues. They are like the point of contact typically for most Americans when we think about medical and mental health. Also, PCPs are responsible for approximately 80% of psychotropic medication prescriptions. So, prescriptions for anxiety disorders, for major depressive disorders. So when you have a situation where like men are not going to the places where anxiety might be spotted, depression might be screened for, PTSD might be, like all of the things that are typically screened for in a medical visit, what you end up having is like a group that is unable to find access to resources and also I'll say fruitful ways to kind of cope with the struggle. I wanted to just highlight one more study.
Yeah, please.
So there's a study by a group called Equimundo that was done in 2023, and it was called The State of American Men. It's a pretty robust study. They looked at 2,022 men who were a demographic and geographic match for kind of men in the United States. And here are some of the things that they saw. I'm going to read these because there's a bunch of them. 40% of all men surveyed showed depressive symptoms. That does not mean meeting the criteria for a major depressive disorder, but exhibiting the symptoms of depression,
40%.
40%. 44% of all men surveyed had a thought of suicide in the prior 2 weeks to the survey, with younger men showing the highest levels of suicidal ideation and depressive symptoms in the survey. Younger men being 18 to 25-year-olds, to classify that. On the other side, 40% of all men surveyed, and I should have named in the beginning, this survey was 18 to 45-year-olds, so there's kind of a cutoff there. 40% of them said they trusted one or more voices in what you all may be familiar with the term manosphere. It's would kind of describe it as a group of online social media influencers that are kind of espousing the kind of like old patriarchal beliefs, the idea of male supremacy, and 4 in 10 men said that they
Described as misogynistic beliefs.
yes, also described as misogynistic beliefs or anti-feminist beliefs. 2 more, and then I'll pause. But
I was gonna
okay,
say, what was the percentage again of the young men who are trusting one voice in that manosphere?
40% of all men 18 to 45, and the nearly half of the 18 to 23-year-old portion said they trusted one or more voice in there. Men ages 18 to 23 have the least levels of optimism for their futures and the lowest levels of social support. And lastly, 65% of men 18 to 23 said or endorsed, "No one really knows me well."
That, of all the statistics, all of them are big and concerning, but that one feels, when you think about what leads somebody to suicidal ideation,
Yeah,
the not having purpose and feeling like no one cares about you are 2 of the top reasons. So young men and boys, it's sorry for the people who are here in person, it can be very hard when talking about serious, really important matters to not get more quiet as you say.
oh, that's very true. Yeah,
So you might notice occasionally us going, oh, because our team is saying, please talk louder, so that people who are joining virtually are able to hear us.
yeah.
Thank you, Ryan. But that last piece feels, both of you have pointed to how society has shifted in terms of what is
Yep.
available for boys and men to identify with in
Mhm.
terms of jobs or opportunities. But then you're also alluding to boys and men not having relationships that provide support,
Mhm.
not reaching out or advocating for their mental health. We haven't spoken yet to the stigmatism for men or boys to talk about feelings or emotions,
Sure.
but you're speaking to that in all of this. How do you believe the situation got here? We pointed to some
Mhm.
parameters for how we're here, but is there anything else that we haven't talked about?
I think the traditional masculine roles that our pre-generations grew up with, like the John Wayne cowboy kind of role.
Yeah.
Do emotional suppression, be strong and powerful and dominant,
Stoic.
competitive, the risk taking. Like these are really they're important masculine qualities, but they were way out of balance before. And I think with Title IX coming on and women getting more equity in the workforce, men have fallen behind on so many fronts.
Yeah.
And
not just in terms of school, but also
not just in terms of school.
identity.
Identity, yeah. So that leaves men, like, where does that leave men? Unfortunately, I think it leaves a lot of young men in the basement on a video game, on the internet,
Or looking at the manosphere.
or looking
Yeah.
with the manosphere, right?
Yeah.
And I think there are a lot of really positive male influences on the internet, but they end up being kind of in the middle of the algorithm.
Yeah.
This guy Richard Reeve talks about this. The middle of the algorithm is kind of where the healthy messages are, and the extremes, the ones that get the attention, are where there are some of these negative, harmful messages that men are getting, what young boys are getting about what it means to be a man.
I think I would, like, connected to what you're saying, I think I'd say that some of the things that I think are factors that are creating this crisis that we're experiencing. The first one would be kind of role confusion. So, for generations upon generations, men have been socialized into a model of like, this is what a good man looks like. This is, if you want to be a man, this is what you need to do. And, in what is, I think, a very positive thing, we're kind of beginning to dissolve the structures and attitudes that I would kind of label as patriarchal. And just to like really quickly define that term, I would define that as a belief in male supremacy and a belief in the idea that those traits that we were just talking about are kind of the gold standard of what is, what everybody needs to kind of vie for. And so as those are dissolving, it's kind of left a vacuum. And I think right now we're in a moment in our society where there, kind of as Derek was saying, like there are people in the manosphere that are saying this is what a good man is, and it's kind of like a return to the 1950s attitudes. But apart from that, there really is not like a cogent, coherent, like clear, defined, like this is what manhood is. And there's not examples of that. They're not like increasingly we're seeing them in the media, but it's not like there's nothing that's like, oh, that's what it is.
There's not a positive masculinity.
Yeah,
Exactly.
exactly.
That doesn't
Yeah,
exist
yeah.
on the media on either
Yeah.
end of the algorithm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And at the same time, I think it's worth mentioning that with this kind of like really important societal change that we're going through, there's a loss of status for men in our society. And I think this is a really like positive thing. I want to really stress that. Like it is, up until quite recently, like men's experience has been centered. That's like, that's the kind of center of everything. And it's getting decentered. And in that shift in power, there's a lot of men that were brought up, socialized to kind of believe, hey, this is my right. And in like it now being more at the edge, they're experiencing frustration, they're experiencing grief, they're experiencing shame. That shame comes online when it's like, I try to behave that way and then somebody calls me out for it.
Yeah.
And it's a series of really complex emotions that, like, lo and behold, I think you were saying this, we haven't been socialized particularly well to know how to be with and communicate about our feelings. And so what do? I mean, I've done this. Like I have a terrible habit about probably when I'm at my lowest, I retreat.
Yeah.
And then later I'll be like, I had such a terrible time, but I'm speaking about it in the past tense. And I think that I think that's the thing that often many of us do, but in this case, it can have really dire consequences. I have like one or two more things to say about it.
Did you want to add anything to what he said so far?
Yeah.
Before you
I think in the,
Yeah, yeah.
I think in the vacuum, a lot of men are angry. I think
Yeah.
it turns into grievances.
Yeah.
And this can, like, right-wing kind of politics can push things to like, let's go back to the way it was. And left-wing politics, and let's not talk about gender issues here that might leave women, downplay women's movements, and let's not call things out too much. So I think, the anger is a big part of what a lot of men are facing, but we're not allowed to do that anymore. We don't know how to be healthy, how to express healthy anger.
On the one hand, anger is an emotion that is considered kind of more masculine to have, or more okay for a man.
More acceptable.
More acceptable.
Yeah.
And also in this spectrum of on the one hand turning to the past, or on the other hand wanting to be inclusive
Mhm.
of all identities, wanting
Yeah.
to be inclusive of LGBTQI
Yeah.
plus and women. Where is the space for the cisgender male, for a masculine identity? Because there is nothing clear. So the lack of
Right.
clarity
Yeah.
is that piece that you're pointing
Yes.
to. And anger is the
And,
emotion.
and confusion with that
Yeah.
lack of clarity.
Yeah.
And not knowing how it is to be a good man anymore. Because we try, but that's not right. So we're either told like be more like your dad or your grandfather, or be more like a woman or a girl.
And what did you want to add? 2 more points.
Yeah, for reminding me. Well, I mean, I think part of this too is that part of the way that we have been socialized is against vulnerability and against it to that end against help-seeking behaviors.
Yep.
And so, what you end up with is men turning to substance use, self-harm, or harming other people as a way to kind of the anger that both of you were talking about. It's a way to kind of express that anger either towards the self or towards other. Um, and it's really, really connected to this kind of belief that to like vulnerably come forward and say I'm not okay is not okay.
Which, and maybe it isn't. I mean, I think that that's something by which I mean perhaps in families or in friendships, in friend groups, that is not something that boys and men experience as being a safe thing to do.
Yeah.
Which is part of why they don't do it, which part perpetuates the cycle.
Totally.
So another point that we didn't get to. So how do we go about reshaping how we talk about male identity? How do we support both boys and men more effectively through language and identity? Yeah, just a little question.
I think something like this is really important, and
Yeah.
making opportunities, spaces for mental health to be a conversation for men to engage in healthy ways,
Safely.
Yeah.
I think promoting sports for boys and men in schools. There's still a lot of participation, but a lot of funding has been cut for schools. For sports, community sports are really important for boys and men. I think just as models for boys and men to be emotionally safe and allow their expression to be what it is without shaming it or trying to guide it into one way or another because it makes you feel uncomfortable. Yeah. What else can you think of?
I think that like the reshaping happens when we as men really, really deeply embrace like a much broader understanding of what it is to be a man that includes like myriad different manifestations of what you might kind of label as masculine or feminine under that big tent.
Mm-hmm.
And I want to be clear, like within that, there is room for kind of the traditional manhood ideas. Like there's nothing inherently wrong with those when they overlay with kind of patriarchal beliefs is where they become unhealthy. But like it's that plus everything else. And I think kind of as you were saying, like that there's modeling in that. I connected to that, I think we need to really begin as a society to normalize vulnerability, emotional intelligence, which I would define as kind of awareness of ability to experience, contain, and communicate about our emotions.
Awareness to experience.
Awareness of our emotions, and then our ability to experience them, to feel them, to contain them so they don't, like end up, I don't know, exploding is a good way to put that, and to communicate about them, to speak to what we're feeling that actually is part of how we contain them. Receptivity, which I kind of define as just being open and being a good listener, and interdependence. And this last one feels important because it does kind of fly in the face of like the old ideal of like the independent, self-reliant man. But I really, these are qualities that like need to have a place under that tent of what it is to be a man. They are qualities that are highly associated with friendship, with intimate partner relationships, with mental health and well-being. And so like they need to be they need to be there, and we need to find ways and like show examples of that. So in that, to that end, I am in a men's group, and we met last week, and part of my share was that I was really scared to do this. I was like, okay, we're not supposed to swear, so I'll just say, what if I mess up? Totally,
Everyone knows
totally.
what you mean.
Yeah. So I was like, I shared, I'm like, it's been a while since I've done something like this, and I feel scared. And, what I was met with was like these men saying, like, we get it, that makes sense. We love you, and like we think you're going to do a great job. And I bring that in because both, like, I think it's important for us to talk about these feelings that often we'd rather not talk about, and also, and more so, just because, like, if we can begin to respond to each other, and Derek is a shining example of this, I would say, but with care, compassion, and love in our vulnerability, that's really going to change the script.
I'm glad that that was the response you got. And
Yeah.
what I hear is that for Matt, the experience of masculine identity, the experience of it,
Mhm.
to be something that is more healthy, less edging towards anger, depression, anxiety, suicide, and all of the challenges that come with every part of that. Boys and men need spaces to be heard safely. They need
Absolutely.
support in learning how to tune in physically to their emotions, how to communicate those emotions, how to seek help. But then on the other end, for that reception to be positive
Yeah.
and not
Right.
judgmental or critical or
Yeah.
aggressive and offensive and downplaying.
Yeah.
How do you envision, this is not a question, but it just makes sense. How do you envision that translating into our culture in terms of school programming or men's groups are a huge,
Mhm.
huge platform for that.
Yeah.
I think boys groups in schools
Okay.
would be really helpful.
Can you speak more to what that could look like?
Sure, just an after-school boys group.
Okay. And
Not a sports, but like, hey, like teachers or administrators in schools, like kind of identifying quietly boys that might be having some trouble,
Huh.
and calling them in and creating some kind of a focus group on what boys are going through. I was the dean of students at a high school about 25 years ago, and I had a boys group with eighth graders, and they're kind of boys that we kind of specifically targeted. And it's like, you guys come, and boy, we had a blast, and we accomplished some things together. And boys, some of them cried sometimes, and it was okay.
Yeah.
which is huge.
Yeah. So
That you even need to say that, I feel like,
Yeah,
is
yeah.
indicative of why we're having this conversation and also why the statistics look the way that they do.
yes, exactly.
Okay, so boys groups.
Well, boys groups, men's groups. There is like this thing about men's groups, and that's great. Boys groups too.
I'd also say, and this is jumping ahead a little bit, but there's a big role for parents in this too.
Yeah.
One of the stats that kind of shocked me, but the APA did a study and essentially noticed that at about the age of 4, boys begin to moderate their facial expressions when they're having feelings. And what happens at 4? Typically, that's around the age when kids begin to join pre-K or some sort of daycare. Like, it's a period where you're in the milieu. And part of why that's important is there is this way that, like, even I think at that age, both the adults and also the other kids are beginning to enforce or police these gender norms.
Yeah.
And that there's some sort of response, like if you're feeling really sad and showing that all over your face, it's like, it's not okay.
Be tough.
It'd be tough. And so, I think for parents, what I would recommend is encouraging communication about your feelings, using language like, you are so strong for sharing this. So kind of really upending, the idea about strong being like, strong, quiet, and on feeling. You know, honestly, it's like I think it's way scarier to be vulnerable in front of people. So, I mean, that takes strength. Modeling it if you're a parent, like normalizing your own feelings. I don't know how many of you are parents out there,
I'm a
but
mom of a 7-year-old boy. That's why I'm taking it.
yeah, and I have a 7-year-old girl.
You do?
I do, yeah, yeah. Uh, Crying in front of your kids and then talking to them about it.
Yeah.
But like normalizing being in your feelings. Um, Talking to boys about like patriarchy and talking to boys about like how our society is changing. I think that there's a big piece, you know, I apologize, I'm jumping around a little bit, but this piece around toxic masculinity,
That's actually what I was going to bring us back to, so dive right in.
oh great. So there's a lot to say about that, but in reference to the parenting piece, I was talking to a clinician friend of mine in the Bay Area today who was saying that, and he works adolescent boys, that's it. And he was saying that one of the take homes that boys in that age group are having is that anything masculine or male is toxic. And I think there's, you know, it's important to kind of think about like the evolution of that term. That term actually began as like part of the men's movement in the 1980s. And it was a descriptor used for a selfish, immature type of masculinity. So it was essentially behaviors that you would see in a man who was just in it for himself and not for his community. And the idea was that like they needed to be shepherded into a more kind of service-oriented, community-minded understanding of themselves.
Yeah.
I think that where it has evolved to is like like maybe the next stop would be people when they're noticing those male traits that we've been talking about with the overlay of like a belief in male supremacy or patriarchy. And when men are kind of behaving with those attitudes, that's been labeled as toxic.
Yeah.
I think more recently what's happened is it's gotten like a little soupy and within there is kind of like anything that is male or masculine is toxic.
So let's dive. It's okay. Let's dive.
Yeah, let's dive into it.
Dive into our questions that we have targeted around this area. So first, I think we often tend to avoid in certain spaces talking about the differences between masculine and feminine, and the traits that can be in general, kind of on both, that tend to be more masculine and more feminine. Yet there are healthy and unhealthy expressions of both male and female traits. How can we reclaim that conversation in a way that's constructive? So how can we shift what those teens are experiencing?
I think opening up awareness and dialogue
Okay.
in schools,
Yeah.
at homes,
Yeah.
with boys and with girls,
Yeah.
about what is it mean to be a healthy boy. And I have a 13-year-old son and a 42-year-old son, two very different fathering experiences. I think I'm better at it the second time. But I often tell my son, like, he's in training to be a man, you know, and I'm his coach right now. I'm also the boss. But I think having emotion, he sees me cry all the time. I'm the crybaby in the family. And and I love that, and he loves that too, I think. I think that encouraging like this term toxic masculinity, it can be a helpful term because it can open awareness and dialogue, and it can encourage change. It can really bring up like what is positive masculinity if it's not this toxic thing. So we need to be talking about these things.
Well, and part of what you both said is that dialogue.
Dialogue,
That's what we need.
yes.
But then there's also, I mean, everyone has a spectrum of masculine and feminine qualities,
Sure.
regardless of how they might identify or what their identity is on that spectrum. How specifically can we talk positively about male traits, honor their place, create a place to honor them in society in a way that offers that alternative, but that healthy masculinity?
Yeah,
Does that make sense?
it does. I think that like I have a slightly different view around using that term, and I think that so kind of as therapists, we're trained not to attack a defense. A defense is kind of like
Hmm.
a way that we all kind of put some distance between what we're actually experiencing or feeling and, reality. Rationalizing is a great one, let's say.
Protection.
Yeah,
Protect-
it's we're
like,
like
yeah.
protecting, yeah. And so we're taught not to do that because if you attack a defense, another one just comes right back in to take its place. And I think that, when we're using that term, we're essentially like calling someone out. So I really understand the frustration and anger at men and at like uh, the beliefs and attitudes that we're using that we're describing when we use the word toxic masculinity. And I think that there's like a really important role for men in particular around the idea of instead of calling out, calling in,
Yeah.
and essentially like with empathy, which is like the therapeutic model, like connecting with someone and encouraging them to reflect on those attitudes, reflect on those behaviors. I actually think that's going to bring about change. To your point, which is like, how do we talk about the positive male traits? I think that can I give an example?
Please.
Okay, because I think that there's maybe a way to think about it is there's a healthy and there's like an unhealthy expression
Sure.
of traits that, we would define as male traits.
Okay.
And the way I would kind of delineate between the two is the unhealthy version is that trait with the overlay of a belief in male supremacy or patriarchy.
Mhm.
And so that's kind of, and I'll give an example.
Okay.
And then the healthy is kind of like the trait itself without trying to reinforce like a rigid belief around like a patriarchal system.
Without the belief that trait is better than or needs to be enforced over.
Exactly.
If the example could not be political, I don't think we should bring politics.
Oh no, I'm not gonna bring, yeah,
Just
totally.
making
Not gonna
sure.
bring,
And I just
not
wanted
gonna
to say,
bring, yeah.
also like that trait is comes through an act of service, not just to patriarchy, male, or one individual. Like it's an act of service. I
Okay,
think
say
it's
more.
important.
Let's dive in.
Well, I think in talking about a trait of masculinity being that which provides and protects,
Okay.
and creating a surplus. Like I can take care of myself by myself. That's great. But I can also take care of other people too. That's great. But I don't force that on other people unless it's asked for. Then I'll provide and on offer. And those are masculine traits that can be healthy. That can be seen as toxic if it's forced on other people. Does that make sense?
Mhm.
And so coming from a place of service, I think is a really important masculine quality.
And that's a energetic shift from the enforcing over,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
To offering up to a place of service.
Yep.
Okay. What was the example you wanted to give?
Really similar. It was kind of the idea of protector and like an unhealthy example of it might be kind of in a cis hetero relationship, using it as an instrument of control.
Yeah.
Kind of policing your partner's relationships, policing their movements, which are things that men do in the name of like, I have to keep you safe. But you can like see how it's actually like, I have to keep you safe and it's my job to do that because I'm in charge, which is that
And
kind of that
because
overlay.
You can't speak your needs to me, so because I need to
Yeah.
decide them.
Yeah, exactly. And then on the healthy side, maybe that is like, for example, kind of like from a social justice lens, using your voice to speak out in a situation where someone who has less privilege from like a social like kind of perspective, where something's happening and kind of using your voice to say like, hey, that's not okay. Like that would be an example of using like, being a protector in a way that is not with the kind of the patriarchal overlay.
So asking,
Mm-hmm.
offering
Mm-hmm.
service, the inherent or the quality of protection or of providing or of helping,
Mhm.
which has been identified within the masculine role over the last hundreds of years in Western European society and other societies, allowing that to still be there, but from a place of not control, not better than, not suppress,
Mhm.
but offering up.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Does that make sense to everything that's
Makes
here?
sense. I have another example too that maybe might be a little bit.
I think
More
examples
clear?
are always great.
Okay, cool.
Stories are good.
So I like this one. I hope that it's like a little bit harder to identify the trait connected to it, but I'm sure you've had this experience of, when you're younger, playing sport, getting injured, being told to shake it off and get back on the field. And the idea with that being like, to be a man, you need to like suppress that pain, suppress those feelings, and like go, essentially. And so I like there's kind of like thinking about the difference between getting injured, let's say you sprain your ankle or you broke your toe, and getting hurt. Like let's say that you fell, bloody, hurt, but you're not injured.
Mhm.
On this side, like is an example of resilience, like getting back, like, okay, I got hurt, like walk it off, go back into the game. That's actually an example of like sitting with physical discomfort
Yeah.
and being resilient in the face of it,
Yeah.
which I think is a very, very important thing for all of us to learn.
Agreed.
And on this side, it's like, if I don't go back in, then I'm not a man. So I need to like suck it up and kind of do that and then get back on the field.
And it might even be, or you might even be applauded by your teammates for doing that, and
Right.
Totally, people
or
Yeah.
criticized or made fun of for not.
for opting out for sure.
Just as it might be for working 60 or 80 hours a week.
Mhm.
Tough it out and do it because that's what a man does.
And not being scared.
And
Not
not,
admitting to fear.
don't complain about it, get sick, it's okay. And be disconnected from your family, that's okay too, because that's what's more important.
So making more space. I mean, I just hear as we have made space and as we continue to strive to make space for LGBTQI plus identities and for women and girls, also make space for boys and for men, and make space within spaces, sports, male spaces, for them to have feelings and for there to be a distinguishing, like a contrast between this is resilience and this is where there's self-injury happening.
Yeah.
This is where there's a conditioning into repression and
Yeah.
bigger problems down the line happening.
Yeah.
Okay. We spoke to this a little bit earlier, but in terms of boys and men and the parenting of boys and men, or
Mhm.
boys, you spoke to showing emotion. You spoke to teaching about awareness of emotion and communicating that, sports, boys clubs. Anything else that you feel like parents or educators can do to support boys at the younger end of the spectrum?
I think one of the most important things for parents, I say this to all of my parents, I say it to myself, first thing to do is check yourself
Mhm.
as a parent before you go toward your child, boy or girl, is check your own emotions and get yourself regulated to where you are. You can sit in your own place of confidence and calm and clarity before we go to our child. So it's role modeling our own emotional regulation, I think is probably the most important thing, because kids are swimming in our emotional waters, I'll say.
It's a really good way of putting it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so that is, I think, really
Yeah.
paramount.
Okay.
And then I think teaching emotional regulation. Gosh, I've got a young 13-year-old boy, and he's really emotionally intelligent. He blows my mind sometimes, and I can recall times when he's gotten really dysregulated. So and I sat with him and taught him, modeled that myself, and like breathe and let's talk through all this. So really connecting with our boys on an emotional level, and men doing that is really important. I think having our kids, boys, be provided really active outlets. Team sports can be great, and individual sports, places where they can learn what they're good at is really important for boys. And providing social interactions for boys is important too.
How do we do that without encountering what is also out there in the sports world for children and men that we just referenced in the example? How can people navigate those waters? You know what I mean?
Yeah, yeah.
Like, go, you need to move, you need to be in sports. Also, in sports, you might find that you're told to toughen up, be a man.
Mhm.
I think there's some need to teach kids. It's not even teaching explicitly. It's through really creating a secure attachment where the kid knows that their needs are important and they matter. Okay, so that when they're actually hurt, they can be hurt and they can cry about it because they're loved regardless, and they're going to be safe. And yeah, sometimes you do got to tell a boy, like, okay, check it out, make sure he's okay. All right, get back out there now. But I don't want to. Okay, I hear that, but let's go anyway. So we do have to push boys.
Yeah.
You know?
Anything else you want to add? Maybe 30 seconds or so?
Sure.
Or
Just that male role models, I think, are really important. I think in our school systems right now, there's a paucity of male teachers. So I think that's something, I don't exactly know how to address that, but I think like representation matters.
Yeah.
And so that is something that if we could address, I think that would help tremendously. And to your point, I think you're probably more the exception. In general, I think adolescents would rather do anything than talk to their parents about their feelings. And so kind of as boys are approaching adolescence, trying to have other adult male role models in their life that they might feel more comfortable with sharing about the complexities of this. And then also maybe to this point around like, oh, what happens though if you join the team and then the coach is like, be a man and don't cry and all that stuff.
Yeah.
Like talk to your kids about it.
Yeah.
And people have different perspectives. We're in this time when there's like many, many different perspectives, but I think that a lot of this does start in the family and kind of talking to them about like, okay, well, like that's how your coach sees it, and we don't, like in our family, we don't agree with that. Like we think it's okay to cry.
What about for men who are older? When we're thinking about supporting young men, 18 to 25, the statistics on men 45 and under that you were referencing earlier in this conversation, men 65 and older. I think this is a statistic I saw. So I did it again. Thank you, Ryan. I will speak more loudly now. Can everyone in the back hear me? Thank you. Okay, great. Was that men over the age of 65 are 6 times more likely as women to die from suicide?
Yeah.
So for men in these other age groups, how can we support?
I think educating men, putting it out there, like, what are the symptoms of actual mental health problems? So, because men might just turn to like, well, I'm just not feeling that great. I'd rather be alone tonight and isolate. But actually, patterns of mental health symptoms, men need to know what they are.
So what are they?
Well, isolating, things like, I'm gonna draw blanks on all
No,
that.
that's okay. Yeah.
No, but isolating and having periods of sadness and that like extend and dysregulated and substance use, not enjoying things that we usually enjoy, or symptoms of depression, angry outbursts that are not congruent with the situation, a level 2 problem and a level 7 outburst.
Yeah.
I use that a lot.
Mhm.
Just so those kind of things for men. But older men, once they retire, like the chance of suicide just skyrockets, because of a sense of loss of connection and community, loss of purpose and meaning and identity, these kind of things. So
Yeah.
What would you add?
I think that kind of as you were just saying, one of the big challenges is retirement. I think that like for many men, especially in that age cohort, and so remember, like I can't do the math, but if you're 65 right now, you were born 65 years ago. Somebody could do the math on that. So it's like the 1950s. Yeah, so it's like thank you. It's a generation that we were just kind of talking about in terms of, and so like you were very, very much socialized into a more traditional perspective of what it means to be a man. And a big part of that is like your work is your life. And then when you retire, that ends. And like what takes its place, like as you were saying, kind of the idea of purpose and meaning are really, I think, important to all of us as human beings. And so I think that the opportunity is perhaps like on a policy level, finding ways to create. Actually, the shed movement is a great example of that.
Yeah.
So there's a thing, it started in Australia. I don't know if it's here or not, but
I think there are a couple.
It should.
But only a couple.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
But essentially, I mean, it stands for what, like sleep, hydration, eating, or no, I don't know what the E is for in the diet, but what it really is exercise. That's the E. Thank you. What it really is it's spaces where men come together and fix things. And they bring, my lawnmower broke. They're whatever kind of, yeah.
Are y'all familiar with this, what we're referencing? So in
Yeah.
Australia, this movement, I think, came from the Australian government
Yeah.
as an initiative to help with public male mental health. And so they created places that they call sheds that are, it's like a, let's say, nice structure. And men can go there, and there are tools and there are things, and literally they fix things together in groups.
Yeah.
And part of that, I think, comes from some research that men are able to process emotion better if they're not looking face to face at one another.
Yep.
If
There's a threat system thing that
Yeah.
happens when we're doing that versus, like
We're
looking in the
talking
same
like that.
direction. Yeah.
Face to face
Focusing
versus
on-
shoulder to shoulder.
Yeah, much
Yeah.
less focusing on something that
Yeah.
happens to be within maybe the stereotype of masculine identity.
Hmm.
Old one. Let's fix things together.
Yeah, totally.
Okay.
Yeah, so I think that there's opportunities there for us to kind of create. What's important is social connection and a sense of purpose.
Okay.
And I think those two things, if they could be solved for in meaningful ways, would really help support that. Because kind of as you were saying, it's 6 times more likely men who divorce and do not remarry are 8 times more likely to commit suicide than women. So they're like that isolation piece is really like. That is I think the probably the primary driver.
Isolation piece, and this is anecdotal, not statistical, but if wives or girlfriends or moms are more likely to call for help for a male-bodied person,
Yeah.
and you're divorced, your
Right.
circle of who might advocate
Yeah,
is smaller.
yeah,
So we only have a few minutes left here, and there's just this conversation we were speaking before. This is a dissertation. This is 1,000 dissertations worth of material to talk about in a relatively short amount of time. What I heard you both say over the arc of this conversation is that in the absence of identity, as our culture has continued to move through Title IX, through women and girls having opportunities we didn't have 60, 70 years ago, there's a lack of positive male identity.
Hmm.
What we can do to help with that is to source role models, possibly from our communities. But I would love to hear if you guys have specific role models in mind.
Oh, it's a great question.
Do you?
Of specific role models?
Yeah. In the sphere. And if you
Yeah,
don't, that's
I
okay.
do,
That's exciting.
but I have notes, so I'm gonna go to them.
Okay.
I'll while I'm finding them, I'll speak about. Okay, yeah, there's a great book that's called Modern Masculinity by Stephen Poulter, who is a psychologist that speaks to this. There's a great podcast called the Man Enough podcast. It is like an actor Justin Balladini, I don't know actually what he was in, but started by an actor and somebody else in the film industry, but essentially it is all conversations about like how can we kind of update our idea of male identity, update our ideas around masculinity and expand that definition. They also have an Instagram account too, so
Okay.
which I think is called We Are Man Enough. If you want to cry, go watch the videos from that because they're all like these just like beautifully heartwarming
Aw.
videos of men behaving in ways that are not
Hmm.
traditionally masculine.
Yeah.
There are, if you're interested in, this is slightly outside of your question, but joining a men's group.
It goes to where we need to end. Which
Great.
is like, how else can we foster support? What rites of passage? What tangible things can we do? So,
Yeah.
so men's group.
You know,
Mankind Project,
Yep.
journeyman,
Journeyman's for
Mankind
boys,
Project,
and
Journeyman,
journeyman.
Good
well,
Men
for boys,
Project.
Good Man Project,
Everyman.
Everyman.
There's one that's called Fathering Together, which
Oh,
is,
that sounds
clearly for dads.
Yeah. Okay.
There's a guy named Connor Beaton. He
Oh, yeah.
has a podcast called
Connor Beaton.
Beaton, yeah, called Man Talks. He's great. Yep.
All right. And just as a reference to those who are sitting in the audience, if any of this is like, oh, that's interesting, but there's no way I can capture that in my mind and remember it, this is recorded and you can see it later.
Yeah, I also said I'm happy to send you
Yep.
an email
Yep.
if anybody reaches out to the practice
Yep.
with a list of these websites,
Okay.
resources. That was the word I was looking for.
Thank you. We have the only thing I feel like we haven't really gotten into is rites of passage. Do you have recommendations for rites of passage to help kind of solidify some of what we're talking about for men and boys?
I'm gonna kick it to you on that just because I
Yeah.
feel like
I mean,
that
Journeyman
was
Journeyman
Yeah.
is a great
Okay.
program that provides rites. It's like structured rites of passage.
Mhm.
And unfortunately, I think boys are left with some pretty unhealthy rites of passage.
Yeah.
You know, and I think it really is up to parents to learn healthy rites of passage. And gosh, what?
Well, I was thinking. I mean, your work with Outward Bound is
Yeah,
what
yeah.
maybe. Yeah. Think
Yeah.
about that.
Yeah, I mean, I used to work for Outward Bound and take kids out on extended wilderness trips. And
Mhm.
It was fantastic. A lot of it was for adjudicated kids. It was probably the worst thing and the best thing they ever did. But I think having men engaged in young boys' lives is probably one of the most important part of having a rite of passage. You know, we don't have structured, here's a rite of passage, and now the boys must be taken away from the woman and brought out into the woods and tied to an anthill and then come back on your own. Like, we don't do that anymore. You know,
Mm-hmm.
instead it's having sex, getting drunk, driving, not healthy ways of
Yeah.
proving our masculinity. So getting on sports teams, going to college.
Which is going back to what you just said, which is part of why teenage boys are so much more likely to die,
Yeah.
not
Oh,
just
yeah.
by suicide, but also from taking risks.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
the kinds of ways that.
Yeah.
Yeah. So please continue. I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, it's like, I mean, boys' prefrontal lobes, executive function areas, is not developed as quickly as girls do. And boys are higher risk takers, especially in adolescence. And without a prefrontal lobe that's going to say and be able to assess risk, they're going to get hurt. So,
And that's one thing Richard Reeves speaks to. This author we keep referencing. His book is, I put it back on
Yeah,
the table.
Of
There's
Boys and Men. It's a
copy
great
of
book.
from the library here in Buncombe County. That's Of Boys and Men. Really great book. Richard Reeves talks about holding boys back a year in school.
yes, yes.
So having boys start kindergarten a year later to give their brains the best chance to be able to like kind of keep pace with the girls.
Yeah.
Anything you would add before we wrap up?
I mean,
No, I think it's an interesting idea though, definitely to kind of because kind of in that one way in the ways that like male sex and female sex brains develop at different paces, that might be really helpful in terms of like what we're talking about, like the impulse control issues, things like that.
Especially if there's also a matrix of support and of emotional intelligence teaching and role models.
Yeah.
It almost seems like there's this potential really great thing where could older men who don't have purpose and jobs, so to speak,
Mhm.
be with younger boys and men and
Mentors.
yeah, like it
Yeah.
would be some kind of a cross-generational shed.
Mhm.
Because it just
Yeah.
seems so,
Mentorship.
I get goosebumps
Yeah.
thinking about like
Yeah.
boys and young men suffering and older men suffering. It's all along the gamut.
Yeah.
Thank you both so much. I always wish at the end of these conversations, but I also today wish we had 3 more hours. In respect of time and those who are here and you, I want to go ahead and bring this to a close. Thank you both for being here.
Thank
Being so
you.
brave as to have these conversations vulnerably. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.